Hello folks, good morning. Just a minute to go. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join us before we start. Morning, Paul. Morning, Sarahjane.
Good morning.
Let's be really vigilant and not start until bang on 11, should we? Just give people a few more seconds to arrive. There we are, it's 11 o'clock. Good morning. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Stuart Henshaw. I'm Business Development Director at Integrated Skills. I'm really pleased to welcome you to this Wider Waste webinar. We run a series of Wider Waste webinars within Integrated Skills. We normally try to do around about 5 or 6 a year, really touching on those topics that might be of interest to clients, non-clients, and really just to kind of introduce some topics that might not be the sort of thing that you would pick up in your daily work within waste management within local authorities. Joining me today, I'm really pleased to have with me Sarahjane Widdowson of Intelisys and Paul Frith of Frith Resource Management. Morning to you both.
Good morning.
Thanks very much for joining me. It's good to see you both. Just a little bit of a background. We expect the webinar is going to be around about an hour. It should be. We'll be finishing at 12. The session will be recorded, so you will be able to see this to your heart's content after. We'll circulate this as a YouTube video, and you'll be able to pass that and circulate that on to other people if this is of interest. Towards the end, we'll be having question and answer, so please use the messaging portal at the bottom to actually ask your question, the burning question you've been thinking about. So thanks very much for joining us. We're looking forward to some fun and an interesting hour where hopefully by the end of it, we're going to be a little less confused by carbon. So to the topic and the title first. Confused by carbon, asking for a friend. One of the benefits of aging, I've got to say, is getting less and less worried about asking the stupid questions. I was just thinking this morning about my high school mathematics teacher in the first and second year of high school, who was one of the scariest teachers I'd ever come across. And if you missed a concept or an idea, there was absolutely no way that you could actually ever revisit that, or you would be horrified. He would be horrified if you actually put your hand up and asked a question on a topic that you'd perhaps touched on the week before or a couple of weeks before. And I think that sort of embedded in me a fear of asking the stupid question. And it's only really as you get older, I think, you kind of think that, well, it's a really good question. It's a stupid question, but I'm probably one of many people who actually are asking the same question. So I'm going to ask it anyway. I'm pretty not too bothered about what people think about that. So firstly, to say there are no stupid questions. I think we'll hopefully get underneath some of those questions about why we find carbon so confusing and why we're maybe slightly embarrassed about asking about it. But just a thought, at ISL, we do the kind of opposite month to this, we do a technical webinar. So one of my colleagues runs something on either RouteSmart or our in-cab technology or back office system. So we invite our clients sit in there and we go through a topic. But one of my favorite parts of that those webinars is actually when we take one question from our support portal during the last period, and we pick up a question that someone's asked, and we've obviously answered it in time, within a few hours or whatever. But we sort of bring that question out, we brush it off, and we present that question to say, okay, here's a really good question. This is the question, and this is what the answer is. And it seems to me to be a really good part of the webinar, in fact, that you're kind of asking those, you're bringing up those stupid questions, and everyone's able to sort of think about that, and makes people realize that there are no stupid questions, etc. So I'm probably labored the point finally too much, but finally, just before we start this, if you are confused by carbon, my advice would be to link up with other people who are slightly less or very much less confused than you are, and which is what I've done today. That's my cheesy link, Paul, Sarahjane, into introducing the two of you. Just grateful that you're actually joining today, and we can talk about this between the three of us. I wonder if I can actually turn to you both and ask you both a question, just to start the discussion off, really, which is to tell us a little bit about yourselves and your experience, very briefly. We'll come back to talk about this in more detail later, but your experience of carbon, and if you could, if I came to you first, Sarahjane, and asked you to do that, but also to sort of somehow link in the answer to the question, why are we confused by carbon?
Oh, why are we confused by carbon? That's a really good. That's a good question. So a little bit about me and also my background, actually, which is quite relevant to this subject. So I'm actually an applied chemist by training. So I shouldn't be confused by carbon. But actually, I think when this debate first started, there are so many different terms out there that people are using interchangeably that actually it took me a little while to get to grips with what everybody was talking about. So after leaving chemistry behind, I went into a career focused really on waste and resources, and that's where I've been working for the past sort of 18 or 19 years. My interest around carbon at the moment is both from as an independent consultant, supporting clients to think about carbon, particularly around their waste strategies and planning for the future. But also, I've been doing a really interesting project for CIWM recently, which is part of Adam Reed's presidential report, which is looking at skills for the future. So I've been talking to a wide range of people across the sector about what skills they and their teams might need in the future to meet future challenges, such as the climate emergency. And actually, carbon literacy comes up again and again as part of that. So I think there are a lot of people out there, to answer your question, Stuart, there are a lot of people who are confused by carbon out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarahjane. Paul, I wonder if I could ask you the same question, but yours is going to be slightly more obscure, which is, yeah, we're confused by carbon, but why are we slightly embarrassed about it? So if you could somehow, weave that into your response about what your experience with carbon to date. Sorry, that's an unfair question, but Paul, you're on mute there, I think. No, not very well.
Can you hear me now? I haven't changed anything, but I'm just hoping it might improve.
I can't hear you very well. Can you, Sarahjane?
No, it's a little bit muted, actually. Stuart, I have noticed actually that some of our audience seem to have enabled video or their microphones. So perhaps we could ask any joining just to mute if that's possible. It seems to be a little.
That would be great. Yes, please. If you have your audio video enabled, please could you mute it? Paul, do you want to have another try?
Can you hear me now?
No, it's very, very faint, actually. Is it a cable?
I don't think so.
I can hear some movement of a cable. Paul, I wonder if while you have a look at that, could you save up that question? I think I'd like to kick off if I can, and the aim of today is to kind of bring everyone up to a really kind of basic level. So some of this might be so very familiar to all of you. Paul, are you back with us?
Can you hear me?
Very faint still.
Oh, okay. I can try and just talk very loud.
That's getting better. Yes, that's better.
Yeah, okay.
Yes,
I'll just talk very loud.
Okay.
Just to come back to your question, I think one of the issues that complicates things for us as waste managers is the diversity of materials that we deal with, each of which have a separate carbon sort of signature, if you like, and that varies depending on what you do with it, that particular material. So that inherently for our sector makes it quite a complex question. And the other thing I would say is, we focus very much on what we take out of the waste stream. So we're looking at what we recycle, which is the most important thing from like a local authority service point of view. That's the biggest benefit you can get, but there's still quite a substantial benefit impact from what's left in the residual waste, which often doesn't get looked at as much. And then there's the other impacts around, the vehicles moving around and the other aspects of the service. So that's why it becomes inherently complex rather than a simple question. I think perhaps I'll just leave it there for the minute and then.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Okay, more from Paul and Sarahjane later. I was just saying about actually going very much from sort of basics. I've got a few slides I'd like to actually just go through. So we're all kind of we're from what is carbon to the kind of the national UK government and local government policy level. So it's going to be about 8 or 9 slides. I'm going to try and rattle through that, but let's see how we go on. And Paul and Sarahjane, you can actually tell me if there's any gaps that you feel that still need filling in. Just to say a little bit about the topics for today. So I'm going to run through a few slides which sort of bring us from basic to local government policy level. And then I'm going to ask Sarahjane and Paul to actually go into a bit more detail on their experiences of working with local authority, what they're doing and how they're actually tackling carbon issues, some of the specific projects that they're working on. And then we're going to have a look at the waste hierarchy, which I find pretty interesting because we're all very familiar with the waste hierarchy. It's been around for years, but actually if we were all to put on our CO2 glasses today and actually look at the waste hierarchy in terms of what the impact of carbon on that waste hierarchy is. So discussion. Then we've got some thoughts, a few slides on local authority actions, things that local authorities could do, and then we've got a couple of ideas for more resources, and then we've got Q&A following that. So let's try and crack through this as effectively as we can. A little bit of carbon. Sarahjane, you should really be doing this, not me. I did environmental policy management. I didn't touch chemistry, and I didn't even get chemistry O level. But anyway, just to say that carbon, non-metal, it's a very solid sort of stable element, but it does come in different forms, and in different forms it has different properties. It's just one atom, which means that carbon is actually an element. I find the interesting thing about all of this is actually much of the Earth is made of it, and we are made of carbon. About 20% of our body is carbon. It's not present as an element, but it's joined up with other atoms such as hydrogen and oxygen. And I like this. All living things consist mostly of carbon-containing compounds. So this should be something that we're very familiar with. We're talking about our own bodies and the environment we live in. Just say carbon dioxide is what we're going to be talking about today. We're not talking about any of the other greenhouse gases. We may in passing, but not. We're going to specifically look at the carbon dioxide, and that is made from a mixture of one carbon atom and two oxygen atoms. What might make it slightly more complex is it's a colourless and odourless gas. So how do we actually, look at the impacts of that and understand the impacts of something we can't smell or see? The next couple of slides are trying to bring us up to speed on the sort of the carbon cycle. So I've pulled together a couple of slides. These are very, very simple, but complex, as we've already discussed. If we were to look at the pre-industrial environment, the carbon cycle is much more simple and much more kind of sustainable and balanced, where there's a relationship between growing matter, between animals, humans, and for many years that was a sort of a balanced relationship between the two. As animals die and organic matter dies, it breaks down, creates fossils and fossil fuels. Plants actually accept CO2 and produce oxygen, which is a beautiful mix, and works very well. However, so we're talking here pre-industrial period. If we go to my next slide, what really happens is once we introduce the Industrial Revolution, we're actually creating new carbon dioxide outputs into the atmosphere. What's worse, we're actually digging up these fossil fuels and fossils. There's material to actually burn, which releases more carbon dioxide into the environment. Let me just, and if you've seen An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's film, a lot of discussion on this hockey stick effect of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is over a very long time. The scale on this is 400,000 years. So it gives you a kind of idea of the fact that we really are, although carbon in the atmosphere goes up and down, we really are seeing this hockey stick effect, and particularly since 1950 we're seeing a major increase in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So since the Industrial Revolution, human sources of carbon dioxide have been growing, and these are really the kind of two main things I wanted to talk about really here. 87% of all human-produced carbon dioxide emissions come from burning of fossil fuels like coal, natural oil and gas. The remainder, 9%, from clearing of forests, so the rainforest, and where they're being cleared for mainly beef, cattle farming. The rest, 4%, is industrial processes, cement manufacturing. And I think that there's a sort of take home from these few slides here. The thing to remember to take forward to our discussion later is our key problem is actually using fossil fuels to make stuff. Stuff is our business within waste management. So the problem here is using fossil fuels to make it. The deforestation is an issue, clearly. I was just trying to rack my brains to think how that might affect waste management, and I thought to a very small extent we may be encouraging deforestation by offering garden waste collection services, but I think that's really sort of splitting hairs, so I think we probably ought to ignore any issue of deforestation, but really it's the key issue we're talking about here is use of fossil fuels to make stuff. Okay, just a breakdown of the anthropogenic factors, so the sources of human-derived carbon: oil, petroleum, coal, talked about deforestation, natural gas and other sources. So again, the majority there, fossil fuel. And we will be sort of touching on this perhaps later on about decarbonisation of the energy supply in the UK. But just this is some stats from last year, which are the current UK energy mix. So you'll see 44% primary oil, 29% gas. Electricity using nuclear, wind, solar and hydro is 16%, and then we've got bioenergy and waste 11%, and coal still helping to contribute 1% to our current energy mix. So still way off, and you know, we will be talking about that I think later on. But there's still a way to go to decarbonise the energy mix in the UK. So we're generating carbon. This is you know, just a reminder, what is the greenhouse effect? So radiation that's coming from the sun is trapped by this layer of greenhouse gases. Those greenhouse gases can't escape, so they're constantly rebounding, creating a warming effect, which is leading to the climate change we're experiencing. So, in terms of policy, what's happening politically in response to this? Well, the first one, the one they're all probably familiar with, is Kyoto, the Kyoto Protocol in 2012. It was actually agreed back in the 20th century in 1997, came into force in 2005. And interestingly, it's actually it's for nations, countries to actually set their own individual targets. So you could set your own target and agree an approach to meeting that target. It wasn't until the Paris Agreement in 2016 where there was actually agreement on a global warming target. So the goal was to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. To achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible to achieve a climate-neutral world by mid-century, so by 2050. So, bringing that to the UK level, we've actually declared, the UK government has declared its commitment to the Paris Agreement, and actually in December last year communicated to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is what we're going to do. So we've got a nationally determined contribution, the NDC, which commits the UK to reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emission by at least 68% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. We actually had a Climate Change Act, the Climate Change Act in place by 2008, which already had a target to actually get to 80% by 2050. And recently, so the government have announced its ambition to achieve net zero by 2050. And it's established this organisation called the Committee on Climate Change to oversee progress to this target. We've got a document that they've produced, which I think we'll find useful later. So that brings us from kind of zero to where we are at the moment. So my next port of call really is to start thinking about, okay, local government actions and targets. And I've got two statements out here really, which is to just remind me to lead in my next question to Sarahjane, which is, okay, could you tell us a little bit about the activities that local governments are involved in and the work that you've been doing with local government, but particularly picking up what we mean by climate emergency and net zero? Sarahjane, please.
No problem. I think so the work that I've been doing recently around thinking about skills for the future. I mentioned that carbon literacy is really lacking, and I think one of the challenges that's out there is that there are so many different terms for what we mean in terms of trying to reduce carbon emissions effectively. So climate emergency, net zero, reducing carbon emissions are all sort of in the mix. Emissions just from the waste sector, I'll just read out some stats, in 2019 were 5% of total UK greenhouse gases. So I know you mentioned, Stuart, that we're going to focus on carbon dioxide in this presentation, but it's worth remembering that that's just one of the greenhouse gases. Not all of them contain carbon, so ozone, for example, doesn't. But we, and also the public, have become used to using carbon as a sort of a catch-all term for trying to reduce emissions and trying to sort of limit greenhouse gases, if you like. So of that 5% of total UK greenhouse gases emitted from waste, about 70% of those emissions from the waste sector were methane, and actually from the decomposition of biodegradable waste in landfill. So actually the majority of the stuff that we produce as the waste sector was actually around organic waste going to landfill. So all of that food waste that's going to landfill, garden waste, etc. as well. So let's have a think. Climate emergency, that particular term. So I think at the end of last year, over 300 local authorities, I think, had declared a climate emergency. So there is a climate emergency at the moment. Greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, and there isn't a single definition of a climate emergency, but most local authorities that have signed up to it have said that they want to be carbon neutral by 2030. 2030 figure is picked because it's a nice sort of midterm target, but also it aligns with some of the Sustainable Development Goal targets as well, which have that 2030 indicator. Now, the other term that you used, which was, I think, net zero, is also used interchangeably with things like carbon neutral and zero carbon. And really, that means no net release of carbon dioxide. So I think the other thing that you asked me about was about what local authorities can do to try and reduce carbon emissions. So they can control, but also influence emissions reductions through a variety of different measures. So they have direct control over certain things. So the building where the depot is, operations, procurement, commissioning of new contracts, or shaping things like their place, plans for the future. They can showcase ideas, form partnerships, and importantly, they can engage citizens as well, because that's a really important part of actually trying to reduce overall carbon emissions. So another interesting stat I read was that more than half of the emissions cuts we need to make actually rely on people and businesses taking up low carbon solutions. So local authority has a really important role to play, both in terms of trying to reduce its own emissions and those emissions from its services, but also trying to influence the wider community on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarahjane. Paul, can I ask you to respond to a similar sort of question? What's your view of the actions local authorities can take, and what is it that you've been involved in yourselves?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. A variety of things, really. I think, as Sarahjane said there, it's the services that are provided and how they are provided are the sort of key things. We get involved in a lot of procurement activity, so and that can be right from street cleansing to collection services to residual waste treatment. And often there's a desire there, because there's been a climate emergency that's been declared, to assess that carbon impact. And when we're talking, and Sarahjane mentioned there about the variety of emissions that contribute to that, we tend to always convert those to carbon dioxide equivalents. So we do always come back to a carbon dioxide figure, albeit it might be derived from a number of different gases.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a variety of elements, therefore, that can be involved in, as it say, it was a collection service. There are the hard infrastructure, as Sarahjane mentioned, about the depot impacts. There is the fuel that might be used by the vehicles. There are the materials that might be collected through the collection service that you might be procuring. You know, you might be looking for continual improvement on recycling rates. That might be the materials. That might be the tonnage. There's also other factors like subsequent transport, you know, how far it needs to go to a MRF or further treatment. And additional factors like engaging the householder to try and improve performance there, or more efficient use of fuel. So a bit like, you know, obviously integrated skills do a lot of work around route optimization and the right size vehicle for the service that you need. So there's a a whole variety of different aspects that can influence on the carbon performance of a collection system, for example. And so procurement's one aspect of that, and how you measure that, how you get bidders to respond on a common basis. And then the second one is more strategic, I suppose, looking at the service. It might not be involved with the procurement. It might be a strategy looking forward. What are their options to deliver? How much can they conceivably move up the hierarchy in order to improve carbon performance? So there's kind of those sort of elements that we tend to get involved in.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of questions to come back to you just at this stage. Could you just say a little bit, Sarahjane, about boundaries? Because primarily we're talking to waste management officers, managers of waste services. One of the key issues, it seems to me, is the whole reduction in consumption. And the question is, the boundary you draw around your responsibility as a waste management service, do you see it as just actually running your services, or do you see it about influencing the public? Could you say a little bit more about the opportunities for influencing the public on this issue? Sorry, it's a massive question, I know.
Wow. So local authorities have powers or influence over roughly a third of the emissions in their local area. So this is connected with what they can physically do with their infrastructure, but also how they can directly influence others. Now, if there are certain local authorities and areas that have really embraced the fact that actually to reduce emissions, you need to form partnerships. You've got to work with local businesses, you've got to work with the community. Local authorities can use all of those levers that they have that are available to them, but actually they can't do this alone. So there has to really be a partnership between central government, local government, communities, etc. Now, for waste services, we already have a role, I think, to engage the public, to try and encourage them to reduce their waste, which is really around sustainable consumption, trying to get people to buy less, to buy better, to transition to a circular economy. But also, we have this metric that's driven a lot of our communications in the past, which is around recycling. So improving recycling rates, trying to get people to recycle more. This has been a really, I know a lot of officers may disagree with me, but actually it's a fairly easy thing to communicate because it's a tangible action. You're trying to get the resident to pick up the bottle and put it in the bin. Now, framing carbon emissions and trying to reduce carbon emissions, trying to get your average resident to do that takes a little bit more thinking and linking to tangible actions that they can do. And it's tough, actually, because the types of decisions that those residents that we all need to make might be slightly uncomfortable. So it might be about thinking about our diet. Are we eating too much? Are we wasting food? Are we eating too much meat? Do we need to eat more of a plant-based diet? I'm sure everybody on this call is absolutely dying to go on holiday this year. But we shouldn't really be taking flights, or we should be limiting flights that we take. We should be thinking about sustainable transport. We should be buying less stuff. But we are, as a free society at the moment, we are free to buy what we want, eat what we want, and we have these sort of freedoms to travel and, go on holiday. So it's all, they're all slightly challenging messages that you want to get over to residents. Whereas, can you recycle? You're not saying don't buy that item in the first place. You're saying put that item that you bought in the right bin. So it's very straightforward in terms of the messaging there.
We've been trying to transition over a number of years now from the concept of waste management into resource management. And Paul, because you run a company called Frith Resource Management, I think you ought to answer this one, really. You're the expert on this. But how well do you think we're transitioning across from waste management into resource management? Because what Sarahjane was describing there is more kind of thinking about how we're managing all of the resource we use.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it has been a steady progress, but not dramatic as we would like. When we're looking at resource management, we're very much looking at sustainable consumption, as Sarahjane referred to there. We're looking at circular economy type models. I'm quite optimistic by the way it's going, to be honest. I'm seeing things at a local level as well. I would say 18 months ago, if I bring it right down to a local level, 18 months ago, our town had no reuse shop apart from charity shops. Whereas now we've got 2 dedicated reuse shops for refilling containers going in, and that's just about household goods. And there's 2 shops in the town, which gives me hope in the way that these things are developing. Certainly, that is the challenge: is to try and move it up to the sustainable consumption element. We can recycle. We've demonstrated we can recycle. We've gone from very little to 40, 50% recycling levels. We can separate, but actually the behavior change that is required for proper resource management is actually to reduce that consumption by reusing things, by purchasing less. And that is a much harder nut to crack, but I do think we are starting to make progress in that area. And knowledge and awareness driven by all sorts of things. We've seen the plastics thing, we've seen the climate emergency. The level of awareness and the level of environmental priority is going up. And there was a publication released recently by the World Economic Forum, which was looking at global risks. It's produced every year. It looks at global risks and what are the biggest risks, and unsurprisingly, infections disease is the top this year. But the next 5 in terms of high impact and high likelihood were all environmental. And this is the World Economic Forum. So they're looking at societal risks, they're looking at economic risks, breakdowns of inequalities and various other things. But we're all environmental, and failing to act on climate was the biggest one of those. So whilst I am optimistic, there is a lot of pessimism or risk associated with not delivering on those themes.
Thanks. Just on your optimism, you've got to say that when a supermarket like Aldi is actually trialing a container-free area in their shops, this message is actually getting over, isn't it? And people are starting to think about changing the behaviour. That's really encouraging. Where we are, I think, fits quite nicely into the next sort of element, which is, we said we'd actually talk about the waste hierarchy and put on our carbon glasses and kind of review the waste hierarchy in terms of carbon. We're all very familiar. It's been around since 2008, the waste hierarchy. I wonder if we could just have a bit of a thought on what the impact of carbon is on this hierarchy. We've kind of touched initially on prevention. I was talking to a client a couple of weeks ago, and one of the impacts of COVID for them was that actually they'd had 2 cars, and one of them they'd got rid of one of them, and actually are now thinking that they won't be buying a second car, that they can actually live quite comfortably with 1 car and share or whatever. And I thought that was a really good example of the whole idea of prevention. But thinking about it with our carbon glasses on here, we need to think about what is it we're preventing here. We're not thinking necessarily about the resource itself, the materials. We're thinking about the carbon involved, the carbon dioxide involved in, well, right back at the beginning of manufacturing, which is extraction of the resource, transporting that to a plant where we're going to make something. So if it was a car, it would be, you know, all the kind of the iron, I guess. I'm trying to think of how a car's made, but iron, the basic metals, you know, bauxite for the aluminium parts, that, you know, it would be oil for the plastic elements, their manufacture, the completion of that, the carbon dioxide used, released in the manufacture, then it would be the transportation to the shops where they're being sold, and then you've got the kind of ongoing carbon dioxide in use. So you've got the kind of the ongoing use of that car. And so prevention, we're talking about actually by preventing that second car that we just talked about there, we're actually preventing that whole carbon dioxide use. Is that, am I, you know, we're on the right tracks here, aren't we?
Yes, no, I'd agree with that. I think the prevention side is it's also a function of purchasing patterns and psychology. We've sort of got into a psychology where your mobile phone is replaced every 2 years for free, you know. So you have that sort of psychology that you kind of need to step to one side of and say, well, actually, my phone's still functioning, so therefore we don't, you know, I don't need to have it replaced. I can keep it going till it stops functioning, and thereby you are saving those emissions associated with, as you say, all the raw materials and consumption and transport and manufacturing that are required in order to deliver that phone. These impacts will vary, though. When you look at those embodied impacts, some activities, their impacts are in their life. Some activities, there's a lot of their impacts are in their manufacture, and that will vary by material, which is why I think it's quite important to have greater awareness and information about those sort of products. You know, if you keep your old car running for longer, is that a better thing, or is it a worse thing, depending on the alternative? And that's where you know, these sort of decisions become quite complex. And I do think that the overall principle of the waste hierarchy does generally work for carbon. You know, if you're preventing something, it's generally better than having to buy it and then reuse it, which is generally better than having to buy it, throw it into your recycling bin, have it reconfigured into a secondary raw material, which is generally better than getting energy back from it. There are exceptions to that. It is not set in stone, certainly, and that's why you end up having life cycle assessment work done in decision making, because that then looks right across the whole board. It looks at the manufacture, it looks at the transport, it looks at the use, and it looks at the disposal.
Interesting. Sarahjane, any thoughts on that? The waste hierarchy and carbon? Is the carbon, should the carbon triangle be an inverted version of that? So prevention, obviously we're using the least, and then as we go down towards the disposal option, we're using most. Is that kind of how you see it?
Well, actually, I've been monitoring the chat as we've been discussing, and somebody, I can't see who it is now, has actually mentioned what about the carbon hierarchy? And the carbon hierarchy really follows the same principles. So the most important thing is around avoidance. So avoiding the creation of the impacts in the first place, which would align with our waste prevention. You know, if we're not making the stuff in the first place, actually there aren't emissions there. The next one is really around minimizing or reducing. So reducing the intensity and or the extent of the impacts that can be avoided. And I think that's really aligned with reuse, isn't it? We're trying to reduce the lifetime impact of those products by trying to make sure that they're going around the system for longer. And also a little bit around circular economy as well. So designing products for durability, for modularity, for second life. So trying to keep those resources in use and maximize the assets for longer. So the next level in the carbon hierarchy is around restoration, so restoring degraded ecosystems or capturing some sort of energy or benefit. It aligns a little bit with sort of recycling and other recovery, because we're trying to use those materials to restore them, to reprocess them, so that there is a parallel there. And then in terms of the carbon hierarchy, we're moving down into sort of reduction, compensation, and at the bottom, offsetting as well. Doesn't really sort of match with disposal, because final disposal, you know, if you send something to energy, you know, to landfill, for example, it's gone. You can only gain a minimal amount of benefit from it. Offsetting is slightly different, but it's still, you know, the last thing that you want to do, really. It's the least best option, I suppose. So there are parallels across the hierarchies, but really I think the focus has got to be on prevention, as is for waste management.
Yeah, very good. I like that. So, I mean, it roughly approximates, doesn't it? You know, so there are definitely relationships between the waste hierarchy and the carbon hierarchy. As we're all agreed that prevention is the best thing we can do, and then the whole idea of reuse, repair. Interesting seeing that you know, the growth of things like repair shops across Wales. You know, really interesting that not just carbon benefits, but all sorts of social benefits in bringing people together to do that kind of stuff, but also the whole message about actually preventing. It also you know, supports the same message about actually sustainable consumption, doesn't it? Keep things going, and actually then in your product choice you're actually looking for things that can be repaired, which is good. Recycling, as we move down, then we're talking about actually you know, where it was our entire focus 20 years ago was recycling. Now we're realizing actually there are other things we can be doing, but recycling is still a very positive thing. You know, the use, there is a use of there are some emissions associated with recycling when we're breaking down materials, but actually it's better than going back to raw materials. We've got to agree. Paul, I wanted just to pick up on the other recovery options, which we're talking here about anaerobic digestion, incineration, energy recovery. It starts to get quite complex there. Just your thoughts in brief on that complexity and how we ought to think about the carbon elements of those.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of rules I think you can apply on this. One is to, which has sort of been picked up in some of the questions, try and keep biodegradable materials out of landfill. So that's one. And then the other one is to try and keep fossil carbon out of energy from waste. Those two are sort of truisms, if you like. The other difficulty around net zero is how you can achieve net zero with residual waste treatment, full stop. And then really your probably only option is to capture that carbon, which you really then looking at an energy from waste or a single stack type solution to try and do that. That's not to say it's a great outcome, because I think, as you said earlier on, the energy mix is getting cleaner over time, and every year that we look ahead, that trend is moving forward, and so energy from waste by definition becomes less clean over time. And you're seeing that now actually in the industry. The industry is moving away from calling them energy plant and saying, well, actually it's waste treatment. That's what we're doing it for, which is a change of emphasis, and that is borne out by the science, which shows that actually it's not. It's becoming less and less low carbon, which was the sort of approach. The other options. So those are the sort of truisms, I think, around carbon capture and storage, avoiding fossil carbon going into combustible processes, and degradable carbon going into landfill processes. Anaerobic digestion it's it has a marginal benefit over and above energy from waste when it comes to food waste processing. It is better, but it's not hugely better. Depends on how efficient the energy from waste plant is. And WRAP recently published, I think a couple of months ago, a carbon metric which looks at the different materials. It's called the WARM report, I think. So if you Google it, then that has got carbon metrics for different materials going to different outlets, whether that's anaerobic digestion, energy from waste, landfill, recycling, and so on. So that's worth a look at when you're looking at these different options.
Thank you. Could I just ask you for a quick supplementary question on that? We talked about decarbonisation of the energy sector. Have you got any views on how quickly that is going? I know you mentioned it's going quite quickly, but have you any more thoughts on how quickly that we can be moving from use of fossil fuels? Because that's a key issue for the move to electric vehicles in waste. Lots of people are talking about it, but actually, it's only effective from a carbon point of view if that energy source is actually not using carbon generated electricity, isn't it? So any thoughts on how quickly that is moving?
Yeah, it's moving very quickly. And that last bit of coal will disappear as well that you had in your slide. But it's moving very quickly. We're in the sort of, I don't know what the exact number is at the moment, the carbon intensity. It's in the 200s of grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, whereas come 2035, that's due to drop down to about in the 50s, I think. So that's the degree of reduction over that period of time, which is very substantial, very substantial. It completely changes the certainly modelling that we would have done a few years ago. The conclusions may well have changed now, and yes, they will certainly change again in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
So that's the dynamic nature of it at the moment.
Interesting. Thanks both for those responses. I've got a few slides just as the sort of aid memoir for moving forward. So some ideas and thoughts. I mean, we had these in here for discussion for local authorities to move forward in this. We've already talked about encouraging reduction in consumption. Sarahjane, you talked about buying well earlier on. How do you encourage people to buy well is a good question. Any thoughts?
Apologies, I was muted then.
No, it's okay.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I think actually one of the things that has come out of the pandemic is that people are becoming more responsible consumers. So they are thinking about what's in their wardrobe at the moment, for example, on textiles or what they can buy. They've had a little bit more time to think about, repairing items, fixing items. So hopefully that sort of trend will continue. Fingers crossed.
Thank you. Supporting reuse projects. Have either of you had any experience of reuse projects in your work at all?
Yeah, so in the past, I've actually worked on a lot of reuse projects for different partnerships. Actually, now I think that's the important thing about reuse. Actually, it can have so many benefits within the community. But you need to work in a partnership to deliver it, ideally, because you can work with, third sector charity providers. You can work with organisations that are trying to enhance skills within the community. Great opportunity for regenerating local high streets at the moment as well. There's plenty of storefront space, so opportunities for more reuse and repair style projects to get to take places in the high street as well. So I think we'll see an increase of these types of projects.
We actually had a webinar. We ran a webinar last summer, I think, with Leeds, who have a very successful reuse projects in the city. That's on our website if you wanted to pick that up. That's really inspiring. And if anyone is actually, any authorities are looking at encouraging partnerships with groups who want to run a reuse project, then that would definitely be something to listen into. Reducing impact of collections, this is something I just wanted to pick up. Paul mentioned it earlier, but it's kind of what we do. If you are providing services, waste services, then it doesn't make any sense whatsoever to run inefficient services. So reducing the impact of those, you could look at using software to reduce the frequencies, improve the quality of the service, which is what's coming out of some of the work we've done with some of our clients. Quality service is important to clients, to residents, and optimizing services, which we can talk about as much as people want to. Moving fleet to non-fossil fuels where possible, which is what we talked about just a second ago, Paul, and depot management. Clearly, every waste management service is running a depot. How often are they reviewed in terms of their efficiency, their insulation, their carbon use? That would be an interesting project in itself, just to look at the depots around the UK and how efficient they are. You touched on procurement, Paul. We are often bidding for local authority tenders, and it's quite interesting to see that actually carbon and carbon reduction is becoming a feature of those. But how to respond to those is quite an interesting one. I think we're all kind of feeling our way through what it means. But it's good that carbon reduction is on there as within tenders. Anything else you would add, two of you, onto that list of kind of that aid memoir for authorities to be thinking about?
Probably just simply communicating with the public to try and recycle more and waste less. I think this goes, there's been some interesting chat actually around local authority responsibilities and where they lie. And these slides are focused on waste management services. So local authorities generally looking at sort of scope 1 and 2 emissions. So these are things like, company vehicles, fuel combustion for scope 1, and scope 2, things like purchased electricity, etc. When we start to talk about communicating with the public, influencing business, that starts to look at scope 3 emissions, because we're thinking more about purchased goods and services. It comes back to that question I think you had early on around where do you draw the boundary? And this is a really difficult question for local authorities, because it also influences what and how you measure things, but also your overall plan for the future. Who do you work with? Who can you influence? What sort of levers can you pull as a local authority? One good report I'd recommend is to look at the Bristol City Council website, but also the sorry, it's just gone out of my head. One plan for Bristol. I'll put the link in the chat, but they've taken the approach of looking at the city as a whole and setting different goals that don't just involve the local authority, but also involve businesses and residents as well. So.
Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's an important point around the facilitating role that the council can make, and working with other organisations. We've done work with councils where they've set up reuse shops, and that they or reuse repositories, if you like, where charities come in and collect items for reuse and take them away. And I think that's quite important, because it broadens out the reach and the scope of the council, which might be quite resource constrained to do some of these things, but there's a lot of willingness in society and from the private sector to develop so these sort of reuse and wider schemes, these circular economy type schemes.
Interesting. I'd as we've been discussing, I think there's one point that we've maybe just not touched on enough would be, we have talked about waste services and waste management, but within each authority there will be someone who's busy on actually, working up the council's response to that net zero or the climate emergency requirement. So I think we'd probably all say that a good thing to do as a local authority waste management officer is to make contact, if you've not made contact with them already, with that person. Not only would it be helpful for yourselves, but actually I think you would probably assist in this whole project and actually be a key player in that. And I think we'd all agree on that would encourage you to actually team up with the person who's coordinating, or the team who's coordinating your net zero response as an authority, because you have a key and important part to play.
Absolutely. I think particularly, just to add to that, Stuart, as waste services, we often procure for really long-term periods. So we're purchasing vehicles, we're developing and designing infrastructure and procuring it. And actually, that has a huge influence on what we do about carbon in the future. So waste services from that side, what we're going to procure and implement, but also, the touch point that we have with the public makes services, they should be really central to any sort of climate emergency plan or partnership.
Thank you. I've got one more slide which I wanted to leave with people, which is we've got a couple of resources here. I'm aware that actually there's been some great chat going on during the webinar, and we were going to have a Q&A session, but I thought since it was already going on during the chat and during the webinar, I thought we'd sort of just continue with that. So we will add any resources that you've flagged up, which many of you have. Thank you very much for doing that. An important document here we've got is this local authorities and the 6th carbon budget by the Climate Change Committee for Climate Change. Is a really good document with lots of stuff in there to read. The carbonliteracy.com is something that Sarahjane pointed me towards. I would encourage you to have a look at that. I don't think there's any need to be embarrassed about being confused by carbon. I think the more we make clear the fact that we need to find out more about carbon between us, the better, and the quicker we'll actually move to sort of carbon-free, carbon neutral, and carbon positive position. Our time's gone, and I just want to say thank you very much for everyone who's joined us, for attending. It's been really good from my point of view. I've certainly enjoyed it. Sarahjane Widdowson from Intellisos, really appreciate your input. Thank you. Paul Frith from Frith Resource Management, both of you, I really appreciate your input, and thanks for giving your time, and really appreciate it. Hope everyone's enjoyed it, and we will catch up with you, no doubt, in the next month or two. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.